She told me Mom is dead. She told me that apparently someone had killed her.
He's capable of anything, including killing me.
For the investigators, the motive is obvious. It's money.
Emmeline is 16 years old. There's a 30-year age gap.
She was scared of Jean-Marie when he got out of prison because she had testified against him.
She always told us, if I die one day, do an autopsy, because she was afraid of being poisoned since he was a chef.
In August 2006, the body of Ghislaine Leclerc is discovered in her house in Volesvres in Saône, Loire.
When Emmeline goes into the room, she sees Mom lying on the floor. She's covered in blood.
It smelled like death.
Who shot this 57-year-old woman? In this exceptional investigation, the police follow many leads.
Miss Leclerc was in the process of divorcing Mr. Said.
Could the murder be related to the divorce?
Said told Ms. Leclerc that she was a bitch and a dirty foreigner and that he would make her bite the dust.
The police learned that the victim used online dating sites.
Be careful. One day you're going to come across a jerk or a pervert.
The investigators also take an interest in the victim's first husband.
During an argument with his in-laws, this man attacked them with a sword. He killed them.
Why did the victim's son-in-law lie?
He admits, to everyone's surprise, that he was at the scene of the crime.
So now the investigators think that's it. He's going to confess.
The investigation uncovers a relationship between the victim's son-in-law and his 16-year-old sister-in-law.
When I find out that Sylvain has been intimate with my little sister, I scream internally. I want to shout.
Sylvain Schroud kept up the attitude that he wasn't involved, in any way whatsoever, in Ghislaine Leclerc's death.
Jean-Marc Bloch, former head of the Versailles Police Department, and Negar Haïdi, criminal lawyer, will join us as we look back on this unsolved case. On Saturday, August 28, 2010, in Montrecol, in Anne, Jean-Paul Pelletier is having a dinner with two of his daughters, 17-year-old Emmeline and 31-year-old Céline.
They had come to spend a few days, and their mother was due to arrive on Saturday.
Jean-Paul Pelletier has always stayed on good terms with his ex-wife, Ghislaine Leclerc, the mother of his three daughters, Céline, Estelle, and Emmeline. Ghislaine has agreed to come to Jean-Paul's for dinner this evening, but late in the evening, she still hasn't arrived.
My sisters keep trying to reach her at home on her cell phone. Nothing. She doesn't turn up. She doesn't call to say she'll be late, even though she would always call us when she was late. She would stop by the side of the road and call us.
Emmeline and Céline are worried because 2 days earlier, on Thursday, August 26th, during their last phone call, their mother confirmed she was coming. Hours pass and there's still no news. Ghislaine's daughters find it very difficult to hide their concern. They know their mother lives 60 miles away. What if she had an accident?
I try to reassure them anyway by telling them maybe something came up. Maybe she's doing something and she can't call.
Jean-Paul Pelletier and his daughters call the hospitals and the emergency services, but they don't get any information.
They try to sleep, but obviously they can't.
The next morning on Sunday, my daughters say, there really is a problem. They say it would be a good idea to check, so we hit the road in the early morning.
All three head to Volesvres, a small town in Saône-et-Loire where Ghislaine lives. At 10:55 a.m., they arrive in front of the house. Immediately, something grabs their attention.
When we arrived at the housing development where she lived, over the hedge, we saw the windows were open, and we thought, this isn't normal.
Worried, they approach the house.
Emmeline had already jumped out of the car. She had already gone to the front door. I came with the key. I put it in the lock, I turned it, and Emmeline rushed inside and looked for her mom.
Apparently, Ghislaine isn't home.
Everything is tidy except for my mother's handbag, which is spilled open in the living room.
Next to the bag, Emmeline finds her mother's cell phone, her wallet, her bank cards, and cash. She then goes to her mom's bedroom.
As there was a light on in her room, and the door was open, she walked towards the light.
That's when Emmeline discovers her mother's lifeless body.
When Emmeline goes into the room, she sees Mom lying on the floor. She's covered in blood. She screams and grabs the phone to call the paramedics. And my dad stops her by telling her that it's no use, because she's already dead.
It smelled like death, so the question didn't even arise as to whether she was dead or not.
Emmeline then calls the police.
She couldn't speak. She was stammering. It was her sister who took the phone to talk to the police. The police told us to leave the house and wait outside. Emmeline ran off into the countryside, screaming with all her being.
Céline, the eldest of the three daughters, then has the difficult task of informing her sister, Estelle, who lives in the south of France.
She asked me to go somewhere alone and sit down. Then she told me Mom was dead, and suddenly I screamed too. And I didn't understand. She told me that apparently someone had killed her.
Ghislaine Leclerc was 57 years old.
For me, my world is totally falling apart. I'm teetering between pain and disbelief. I'm in a state where things don't seem real.
The discovery of a crime in Volesvres hits hard for the population of around 600. There's no police department here. So it's the investigators from Paray-le-Monial, a town 3 miles away, who arrive at 11:05 a.m. Their primary mission? To cordon off the crime scene and wait for their colleagues in homicide to arrive. At 12:15 p.m., 2 forensic technicians from the Saône departmental squad arrive on the scene. They start by searching Ghislaine Leclerc's car.
The investigators discover a blue windbreaker inside Ghislaine's car, which is parked in front of her house.
This men's jacket is put in evidence. The investigators then explore the victim's garden. While searching the hedge, they find a set of keys hidden in the foliage.
The set included the keys to her house and one of her cars.
The police know that when the body was discovered, the front door of the house was locked.
They deduce that the perpetrator may have thrown away the keys to delay the discovery of the victim's body.
The investigators then inspect the windows of the house, which show no signs of a break-in. On the first floor, several of them are open.
On the ground in front of one of the open windows, the investigators find footprints and trampled grass, traces which seem human.
The forensic technicians enter the house and search for fingerprints on this window.
On the handle, they discover fingerprints.
But these incomplete prints are unusable. The police then try to find other fingerprints. In vain. In the rooms, there are no signs of a struggle or mess that could suggest a burglary gone wrong. The only exception is Ghislaine Leclerc's handbag found by her daughter on the living room floor.
The investigators realize that nothing has been stolen. 200 euros are found on the floor. There are Ghislaine Leclerc's 2 bank cards. Her phone and laptops are also found. So the investigators don't think it's a burglary since nothing is missing.
All these objects are photographed and sealed. In the kitchen, the officers find 3 brioche buns. They ask Ghislaine Leclerc's daughters about them.
My mother used to make her breakfast on a hot plate. There were 3 brioche buns out, even though normally she only ate 1.
The investigators then look for DNA traces from a possible visitor.
The investigators swab the dirty dishes that are in the dishwasher.
The forensic technicians then head to the victim's bedroom.
There are several dried bloodstains. They are small and spread everywhere in front of the bedroom door.
In Ghislaine Leclerc's room, the window is closed and the bedside lamp is on. The bed is unmade on the right side. Women's clothes are placed on the left side. The curtain that covered the closet is on the floor, stained with blood. The murder was committed with a firearm. Investigators find 4 cartridge cases between the wall and the victim's bed. The killer therefore fired at least 4 times, but only 3 bullets are discovered. The investigators then inspect the position of the body at the foot of the bed.
The victim is in pajamas and barefoot. Slippers are found next to her legs. Under the victim's body, there's a pool of coagulated blood.
A medical examiner arrives at the scene at 3 a.m. to confirm the victim's death. Ghislaine Leclerc's body is then taken to Mont-Soleil Hospital for an autopsy. By studying the position of the bloodstains, the investigators try to reconstruct the sequence of events. According to the experts, the first shot was fired while Ghislaine Leclerc was near the closet.
Her first movement was probably to put a hand to her wound, then to stand up. In any case, the curtain brackets are too weak and it falls down.
The victim would then have gone towards the bed, probably crawling on the floor.
On the ledge of the bed, there's a handprint. We know that the person was sitting, curled up, perhaps leaning on the bed.
Finally, Ghislaine Leclerc moves slightly towards the door. The large bloodstain found under her body indicates that she collapsed there before dying. Analysis of the samples reveals a male DNA profile.
They find male DNA in a bloodstain. This DNA is mixed with the victim's.
Could this DNA be the killer's? That would make this their only mistake, because the crime scene investigation does not turn up any clues to put the police on a lead. Jean-Marc, the forensic technicians stayed at Ghislaine Leclerc's house for 9 hours. They took many photos, collected many samples, and wrote down all their findings. What can we gather from this crime scene?
Of course, 9 hours may seem like a long time, but in fact, this is a completely normal length of time, especially since this is a house protected from uncontrolled comings and goings, and sheltered from bad weather that could damage clues. In this kind of situation, you can take your time. You should take your time. Returning to our case, what I gather from these findings is that Ghislaine Leclerc was in her pajamas. Her bedside lamp was on, and the buns in the kitchen were untouched. So it's likely that she was surprised by her killer just as she was going to bed.
Jean-Paul Pelletier, Ghislaine Leclerc's ex-husband, says that when he entered the room on Sunday morning, August 29th, there was a smell of death. Can this information tell us approximately when the death occurred?
I'm not a medical examiner, but I know from experience that the first odors due to the decomposition of a corpse appear in an enclosed place at a normal temperature of 64 to 68 degrees after 24 hours. We know the victim's body was discovered on a Sunday morning, so the death occurred at least on Saturday morning. As I said, she was most likely surprised and killed one evening when she was going to bed. We also know that the last phone call she made to her daughter was on Thursday afternoon, so she was killed either on Thursday evening or on Friday evening.
When the body was discovered, the front door of the house was locked and a window on the first floor was open. The police later found the keys to the house in the garden. What do you deduce from these findings?
Given the footprints observed below the open window, we can deduce that the killer entered the house through this window. After committing the murder, for the sake of discretion, they came out through the door. And of course, they quickly got rid of the keys, which would be extremely incriminating if they were discovered.
According to the investigators, the killer locked the door to delay the discovery of the body. Why was this precaution taken?
The killer was trying to put as much distance as possible between the crime and the start of the investigation. What's their objective? Perhaps to erase some clues or to create or refine an alibi.
Which could mean that the killer was afraid of being suspected quickly.
Yes, it's possible that they thought they would soon be in the investigators' line of sight. We can see that this crime was carried out methodically, in cold blood. Only one trace of DNA was found, mixed with a blood stain. No exploitable fingerprints could be found at the crime scene. This abundance of precautions could suggest that it was a premeditated murder, an assassination.
The Dijon investigation unit is put on the case. The investigators then try to find out who Ghislaine Leclerc was. How did this 57-year-old woman live? Who was she close to? What could explain such a violent murder? The character investigation needs to answer all these questions. Ghislaine Leclerc lived alone in Volesvres, a small town in Saône-et-Loire. She had moved there in 2007 with her third husband, Saïd, who she was in the process of divorcing. Married and separated 3 times, Ghislaine was a woman who stood by her choices, independent and determined to live life to the full.
My mother was also a businesswoman, and she carried out her projects successfully. She fought for what seemed right to her, and she wouldn't give up.
Ghislaine had created her own publishing house for postcards and children's games.
Imagine Edition's slogan was "A world of gentleness." Very beautiful images made with carded and colored wool. It was really a wonderful world for children. She wanted to bring them dreams and serenity.
Ghislaine was hypersensitive. She was very emotional. She would cry at injustice, even if it had nothing to do with her. She was very emotional.
Her 3 daughters, Céline, Estelle, and Emeline, remember a very loving mother.
Mom was very affectionate. Kindness was very important to our mother. She sang songs to us every night and every morning. She massaged us, she told us stories, and she was very present. She was very sweet.
Ghislaine made sure her separation from Jean-Paul Pelletier affected their 3 daughters as little as possible.
She gave us her all. We were the center of her world. She would have moved mountains if it could have helped us.
Denis Marchal knew Ghislaine for more than 30 years. He was one of her oldest friends.
Ghislaine was a 1968 protester who hadn't come down from the barricades. Maybe that's the best way to describe her. She was a humanist, very attentive to others. And throughout her life, she stayed somewhat naive.
All of Ghislaine Leclerc's loved ones praised her generosity.
She was very generous to everyone. Too generous. She didn't know how to say no. She wanted everyone to be happy. That's what she cared about.
But this perhaps excessive generosity didn't stop the mother from standing up for what she believed in.
Ghislaine had a rather uncompromising character. When she wanted something, she did everything she could to achieve her goals.
She had a temper, that's for sure. If she didn't like something, she said it. She had absolutely no fear of crossing swords with anyone.
The murder of this strong woman who was loyal to her friends and bursting with love for her children is incomprehensible to her loved ones.
I never knew her to have any enemies. She was so generous with everyone that the fact she was killed made no sense to me.
The day after the discovery of the murder, on August 31st, 2011, Ghislaine Leclerc's body is autopsied at Monceau-les-Mines Hospital. A ballistics expert from the National Forensic Police Institute in Écully is requested to participate. Before starting the examination, the medical examiner requests a body scan.
The image immediately finds a metallic object. It's a bullet in an area where it can be seen very clearly since it's in the breast tissue.
The medical examiner then performs the external examination. He observes 4 entrance wounds and only 3 exit wounds because one of the bullets is still lodged in the right breast. The medical examiner concludes that 2 shots were fired first.
A shot through the neck with shallow penetration, since there's an entrance and an exit. A second shot through the abdomen, approximately in the umbilical region, going from the front to the back.
The horizontal trajectory of these 2 shots allows the doctors to establish that they were fired while Ghislaine Leclerc was still standing. However, the other 2 shots have vertical trajectories, from the top to the bottom.
There's a shot through the chest. It's under the left collarbone and exits through the back. Then there's the last shot, the one that didn't come out. It's between the back and chest. It touches the lungs and enters and stops in the breast.
For the doctor, these last shots were fired while the victim was curled up on the ground. Internal examination of the injuries makes it possible to establish the cause of death.
The death was quick, caused by respiratory and then cardiac failure, as well as internal bleeding.
Ghislaine Leclerc did not suffer sexual violence, and her body does not bear any defensive wounds. At the end of the autopsy, the medical examiner concludes that the death took place between Thursday, August 26th and Friday, August 27th in the evening. The cases and bullets found at the crime scene are sent for analysis to the National Forensic Police Institute in Écully. The experts need to determine what gun was used to kill Ghislaine Leclerc. Jean-Marc, the ballistics examination establishes that the murder weapon was a Beretta M1934. What can you tell us about this gun?
The Beretta M1934 is a small, short, light, and very maneuverable handgun. It's a semi-automatic pistol with a caliber of 9mm and a magazine capacity of 7 rounds. This weapon was used by the Italian army from 1934 to 1945. Just over 1 million units were manufactured. Today, it's considered a collectible gun.
So the police identify all the collectors who have declared this type of weapon, and they discovered that there are only 112 in France.
Yes, this doesn't seem like much when you know that more than 1 million units were manufactured. But when we talk about collectible guns, there are also guns kept in drawers. There are guns that circulate or are passed down from generation to generation without anyone declaring them. In any case, the police had these 112 semi-automatic pistols assessed. It turns out that none of these 112 guns is the murder weapon.
At the same time, Jean-Marc, it's hard to imagine a collector who has declared their gun using it to commit a crime.
Yes, but as you know, imagination doesn't have a place in a legal police investigation. A legal police investigation involves systematic checking, and that's what the police are doing. They are right to do so. What's more, it could well be that one of the declared owners of this gun lost it, or had it stolen. In that case, the gun would have taken on another dimension.
The autopsy findings confirm that the killer shot his victim 4 times, and that Ghislaine Leclerc had time to move between the shots, from the closet to her bedroom door. What do you deduce from the killer's modus operandi?
Once again, this proves the killer's determination, especially when we know that there were 2 rounds of gunfire. A first round of 2 shots while Ghislaine Leclerc was standing, and a second round of 2 shots while she was on the ground. This second round of shots proves the killer wanted to make sure that the victim was definitely dead.
The autopsy also showed that Ghislaine Leclerc's body did not bear any defensive wounds.
This proves that there was no altercation before the shots were fired. The perpetrator probably entered the house, then Ghislaine Leclerc's bedroom, where the light was on, and shot her by surprise when she had no way to defend herself.
Ghislaine Leclerc's body was discovered by her daughter, Emmeline, on Sunday, August 29th at around midday. But the medical examiner could not say for sure when the murder took place. Witness testimonies have therefore become the police's priority. Ghislaine Leclerc lived in a quiet residential area where the sound of gunshots may have alerted the neighbors. The Dijon Investigation Unit conducts a large-scale neighborhood survey.
The first finding appears quickly. No one heard or saw anything.
It seems that Ghislaine Leclerc was a particularly discreet neighbor.
The neighbors pointed out periods when their neighbor was silent or absent, without giving them cause for concern.
A couple of neighbors saw the victim a few days before her death. It was Monday, August 23rd, and Ghislaine Leclerc was in the company of a tall man, who the neighbors saw arriving by taxi late in the afternoon.
The same evening, both were seen by several neighbors having dinner and chatting quietly on Ghislaine's terrace.
Who was this man? The investigators questioned the victim's family, and they learned that the man who came to Volesvres 6 days before the murder was discovered is Sylvain Schrott, Ghislaine Leclerc's son-in-law.
My brother-in-law had a car accident, so he took a taxi to my mom's house, and he borrowed one of her cars. He was the one my mother's neighbor saw on Monday the 23rd.
Sylvain Schrott is the partner of Céline, Ghislaine's eldest daughter. When interviewed by the police, he confirms going to his mother-in-law's house on Monday, August 23rd at around 6 p.m.
Sylvain Schrott had a car problem, and he asked his mother-in-law to lend him a sedan she owned. He went to her house to get the car. In his explanation, he gives a very detailed account of the evening, including what his mother-in-law prepared for him for dinner. He insists the atmosphere was good.
The investigators asked Sylvain Schrott what his relationship with Ghislaine was like. He responds that it was very good. He got along very well with her. She was his mother-in-law, and it was thanks to her that he met his partner Céline in Alsace.
Sylvain Schrott claims to have left Volesvres at around 9 p.m. in Ghislaine's car. He drove a little less than 4 hours to cover the 180-mile distance to his home in Recquevire in Alsace. At around 1:10 a.m., he arrived home, where he stayed until his mother-in-law's body was discovered.
So when Mom was found dead, he was the last family member to have seen her alive.
The neighborhood inquiries provide the police with another interesting piece of information. A man came to garden at Ghislaine Leclerc's house about 10 days before her death.
The investigators learned that some neighbors saw a man around the victim's house trimming the hedges.
The neighbor reported seeing this man because he wasn't a regular in the neighborhood, and this was the first time that he had visited the housing development.
They describe him as a rather tall and thin man, aged between 30 and 40, Caucasian, with long, light hair and a goatee.
When questioned by the investigators, Ghislaine's loved ones explained that he was a homeless man passing through Paray-le-Monial, the nearest town.
My mother met a homeless man in the village who had a jobless sign. She talked with him, sympathized, and invited him to trim her hedges.
In exchange for his services, Ghislaine promised him a few meals and a little money. Then she took him to her house.
I thought it was a bit risky to bring a stranger into the house like that, without knowing where he came from. As much as he's a good person, he may not be. It shows how much she wanted to help everyone.
It seems that when the time came to take the homeless man back to town, he was very forward, and Ghislaine had to firmly decline his advances. Could this man be involved in the murder? The investigators search for him. They contact the St. Vincent de Paul homeless shelter, which is only 2.5 miles from the victim's home. They learned that a man matching the homeless man's description stayed there between August 16th and 19th.
The manager of the shelter also confirms that the person in question often does gardening work and regularly stays at the shelter.
But it's impossible to know where he went after his departure. The homeless man's name is entered in the wanted persons database.
The investigators try to reconstruct the schedule of the person who trimmed the hedges. As they know he's homeless, they call the emergency shelter service. The emergency shelter service confirms that this man called them to find out on the morning of August 26th which accommodation he could go to.
The investigators identified the landline number the homeless man called the service from.
This number belongs to a woman who acknowledges hosting the homeless man from time to time. She becomes the link between the investigators and this person.
The man is finally located and immediately questioned by the police.
He confirms that he carried out gardening work at Ghislaine's house 2 days in June and on August 17th and 18th.
He adds that on that occasion, he left his windbreaker in Ghislaine Leclerc's car. The investigators then ask him to give details of his schedule the week of the murder. They want to know where he was from Thursday, August 26th. The homeless man explains that he was in a shelter in Chagny, a small town 50 miles from Volesvres.
He says that he stayed there for 4 days and slept there at night until August 30th. During the day, he begged, and at night, he slept there.
The homeless man claims to have left on August 30th by hitchhiking towards the south of France. His alibi is checked. The homeless man is telling the truth. He was in Chagny at the time of Ghislaine Leclerc's murder.
The manager of the shelter in Chagny tells the police that the homeless person they're investigating is a quiet and simple man who reads a lot and gets around on foot.
The investigators are convinced that the homeless man is not involved in the murder. So they continue their investigation in search of a new lead. Since the neighborhood inquiries have not made it possible to find out the exact time of the murder, the police will now try to find out when Ghislaine Leclerc last showed signs of life. Her phone records soon provide essential information.
They noticed that on the night of the 26th to the 27th, she tried to call a number 5 times. The first time at 10:18 p.m., a call that lasted 29 minutes. Then she tried to call that same number 4 more times, unsuccessfully.
Ghislaine Leclerc made her last call at 12:06 a.m.
After, there were no more calls. That was the last call Ghislaine ever made.
By analyzing the victim's phone bill, the police see that Ghislaine Leclerc made a lot of phone calls. They deduced that she was killed just after this final attempted call. The crime would therefore have taken place on the night of Thursday, August 26th to Friday, August 27th after midnight. On September 2nd, 2010, 7 days after the murder, the owner of the last phone number dialed by the victim is brought in by the police. He's a 55-year-old man who lives in Brouillet in the Paris region. This individual, who we will call Mario, prefers to remain anonymous today.
I told the police that we met online, on a dating site. We called each other often because we hit it off quickly. We were planning to meet to see how things were in person.
Mario and Ghislaine met for the first time on August 19th during a folk dance festival.
She liked to dance well, so we spent part of the night dancing at this festival.
Mario tells the police that nothing further happened with Ghislaine Leclerc.
The connection was very good, but simply physically, neither of us matched what the other was looking for. So we spent 2 days together. We danced and we had fun. But as we didn't hit it off physically, we decided to go our separate ways on good terms.
Both of them went home separately on August 21st. The police want to know where Mario was the night of the murder.
I was at home. I remember that she called me at around 10 o'clock. We talked for about 20 minutes. Then I went to bed, and I realized the next day that she had tried to call me several times after 10. But because I was sleeping, I couldn't answer those calls.
The investigators then study the GPS tracking of Mario's cell phone. They want to make sure that he was at home in the Paris region on the night of the murder. These checks indicate that on August 26th and 27th, he was indeed in Brouillet, 250 miles from the crime scene. But his phone was turned off from 11 p.m. to 7:58 a.m. What was Mario doing during these 9 hours?
Checks are carried out to establish whether a round trip was made during the night.
But the investigators find no trace of a possible nighttime trip. They then compare the man's DNA to the male DNA profile found at the crime scene.
But it turns out to be negative. It isn't this man's DNA.
So there's no reason to doubt Mario's statements. The man is in the clear. But before leaving the police station, he gives the investigators an important piece of information.
Shortly before her death, she told me she was going to meet up with someone she had gotten to know online. But she didn't feel good about meeting this person in real life.
And it seems that Ghislaine also shared her fears with her friend Denis.
She said to me, "Listen, Denis, I don't have a good feeling." I remember she told me, "I don't know what I'm walking into, but I'll go anyway."
Ghislaine was supposed to meet this man on August 25th, 2 days before her death.
Ghislaine was uncompromising and stubborn. It wasn't worth telling her not to go. She told me, "I'm leaving you his phone number, keep it, and if something happens to me, you can tell the police."
Denis Marchal clearly recalls his concern and how eager he was to hear from his friend.
I think that might be the last phone call I made to her. I called her to check that she was home. I asked her, "How did it go?" "Nothing special. It's not going to go anywhere. It was a waste of time. A date like dozens of others she must have had before."
Denis Marchal then gives the police the mysterious man's contact details.
The investigators studied this man's GPS tracking. They realized that he spent the day of August 26 in his town, Digoin.
This information is interesting because Digoin is only 9 miles from the victim's house.
But on the night of August 26 to 27, it's impossible to determine where his phone was, since his phone was turned off between 11:59 p.m. and 8 the next morning.
So the man could have easily killed Ghislaine and returned home at night. On September 3rd, 2010, 8 days after the murder, the police decide to interrogate him.
This man admits to meeting the victim on August 25th around 7 p.m. in the village where she lived. They talked, she told him about her daughters and her life. He did the same, but they left it at that. There was no follow-up. He says he went back to his house and spent the night there.
His DNA is taken and compared to the unknown profile found at the crime scene, but the result is again negative.
The police let him go because there's no motive, and they have no evidence to suggest he was involved in Ghislaine's murder.
The investigators now know that Ghislaine Leclerc met men through online dating. They wonder if the killer could be one of her dates.
My mother was always looking for the one, the man she could count on, the man she could rely on.
Ghislaine felt alone despite having her daughters. She had a deep feeling of loneliness.
We were aware that my mother was always looking for love on dating sites. It wasn't very comforting, but I trusted her judgment.
It's like walking into the lion's den. I used to tell Ghislaine, "Be careful. One day you're going to come across a jerk or a pervert, or you're going to get mixed up in something bad." She would respond, "It's okay. I'm being careful. I'm a big girl. Don't worry."
The online dating lead is now at the center of the investigation. The investigators want to identify the men the victim met this way shortly before her death.
The technology specialists inspect Ghislaine's computers, her hard drives, and her phones. It's an enormous job.
They discovered that around 20 men have been talking to the victim, 23 men.
All these men are brought in by the investigators. All their alibis are checked.
All these men have their cell phones GPS tracked, but none were in Volesvres on August 26th, the night of the murder.
The investigators study the nature of all the messages exchanged between Ghislaine Leclerc and these 23 men.
But the police find no motive, no arguments, or in any case, anything to suggest that one of these men could have killed Ghislaine Leclerc.
So the online dating lead is abandoned for good. Nagar, as we just saw, Ghislaine Leclerc was looking for a soulmate on dating sites. Her friends and family said that they were scared that she would put herself in danger. Are checks carried out on the people who sign up to these sites, or can anyone create a profile? Anyone, even a sex offender?
There are no checks on these kinds of websites. For example, a copy of their criminal record is not requested. There is no verification of personal data such as the identity, age, or address of the people who sign up. So it's possible on this kind of site to meet the wrong kind of person who could potentially be dangerous.
Without going as far as physical violence, users of these dating sites can be victims of scams or embezzlement. Do these sites have a legal responsibility in these cases?
No. Fraud, embezzlement, or scams are not the responsibility of the websites. In general, they have a responsibility when problems arise in the management of certain data. For example, defamatory comments on a site that are slow to be removed. And then there's the personal data that is collected directly from users. Websites have an obligation to guarantee confidentiality for this data. In 2015, the National Commission on Informatics and Liberty put 13 dating sites on notice for their poor management of confidential data.
I'd like to come back to the investigation into the homeless man who Ghislaine Leclerc took to her house to do gardening work. For the purposes of the investigation, the name of this man was registered in the wanted persons database. Nagar, who are the individuals registered in this database?
Anyone whose legal situation must be checked, or who is the subject of a search, for example, because they have been reported missing in suspicious circumstances, or, as with the homeless men in our case, because they are under investigation and it's imperative to find them to question them. But you should know that registration in the wanted persons database isn't necessarily permanent. If the registration becomes irrelevant, then the name must be removed from the database. Going back to our case, the authorities probably removed the homeless man's name from the database when he was finally found and questioned.
After the dating site lead, the investigators turn their attention to the victim's married life. They've learned that Ghislaine Leclerc was married 3 times. Could one of these marriages be behind the murder? The victim's husbands are now at the center of the investigation. Ghislaine Leclerc got married for the first time in 1972, when she was just 18 years old. Her union with Jean-Marie was welcomed by her family.
At first, Ghislaine found Jean-Marie very funny, cheerful, playful, and pleasant to live with. They smiled a lot. They seemed to be a happy couple.
But over time, Ghislaine and her loved ones noticed a change in Jean-Marie's behavior.
Slowly, his mood changed. At some point when I came over, I felt a hostile energy, and I didn't understand why. He fell into a pretty serious depression.
Ghislaine even confessed to her sister that she was afraid of her husband.
She told me and finally showed me that he slept with a sword under his bed. This scared her, and she feared for her life.
It really scared her, and since he was a bit violent, she separated from him very quickly.
After this separation, Jean-Marie remarried, but his new marriage soon turned into a nightmare.
During an argument with his in-laws, this man attacked them with a sword. He killed them.
For this double murder, the man was sentenced in 1985 to 15 years in prison.
He got out 11 years later, in 1996. When he got out, he started a new life and moved to Lorraine.
For the investigators, this lead is of great interest, and even more so when Ghislaine's loved ones tell them essential information.
Ghislaine was scared of Jean-Marie when he got out of prison because she had testified against him. So she didn't feel safe at all.
She was afraid of revenge, that's for sure. A year before she died, we talked about it, and she told me, "I'm afraid of Jean-Marie." Yes, she was still afraid of him.
For the police, Jean-Marie is a serious suspect. On October 1st, 2010, 35 days after the murder, the investigators bring in Ghislaine Leclerc's first husband. At the time, he's living in Metz.
He tells them with astonishment that he didn't know his ex-wife died suddenly or that she was killed. He also tells them that when he got out of prison, he was no longer in contact with his first wife. They didn't talk anymore, and they had lost touch.
Jean-Marie denies any involvement in the murder. He claims not to have left his home the night of the crime. GPS tracking of his phone seems to confirm his statements. The police then take his DNA.
To check if it matches the DNA found at Ghislaine's house. But once again, it doesn't match. It isn't the unknown male DNA.
Jean-Marie walks free from the police station. There's no evidence to incriminate him. The investigators continue to dig through Ghislaine Leclerc's personal life. They immediately rule out Jean-Paul Pelletier, her second husband. Her third husband, who we will call Saïd, captures all their attention. The 31-year-old Tunisian becomes the suspect of numerous investigations.
The police learn that Miss Leclerc was divorcing Mr. Saïd, and that it was a very difficult breakup. At the center, there was a very big property dispute.
The police want to find out everything about this third marriage. They learn that Ghislaine met Saïd during a trip to Tunisia in 2004.
Mom was staying at a hotel on the island of Djerba. There was a very nice waiter who she found handsome and who took an interest in her. She fell in love with him. When she met him, it was love at first sight.
When Ghislaine returned from Tunisia, she was radiant and happy. She told me, "I'm in love. I've met someone wonderful. He has a beautiful smile. I love him. He loves me."
At the time, Saïd was 26 years old. Ghislaine was 51. Less than 3 months after meeting, Ghislaine and Saïd decided to get married.
My reaction was, "You're completely crazy." Once again, she did what she wanted. She didn't listen to me.
At the French embassy in Tunisia, they tried to discourage Ghislaine from marrying Saïd.
And that many Tunisians tried to marry French women to be able to come to live in France.
But for Ghislaine, these warnings went unheeded. And on July 28, 2004, she married Saïd in Tunisia.
It was a beautiful Tunisian wedding. My mother was radiant. She was glowing. She felt like she had found her life's purpose.
In 2007, the newlyweds bought a house in Volesvres. Ghislaine financed the purchase with a contribution of 615,000 euros. Together, they took out a loan of 100,000 euros. In Tunisia, Ghislaine bought an olive grove and had a villa built on the island of Djerba.
She wanted that house to be the family holiday home, where we could all get together. She pictured the house as a place full of joy, to make happy memories.
At the time, Ghislaine Leclerc had total faith in her husband.
Everything that Ms. Leclerc bought in Tunisia legally belonged to her husband. Since Ms. Leclerc didn't have Tunisian citizenship, she couldn't own anything in that country.
However, Ghislaine spent money lavishly.
All of her savings were spent in Tunisia, whether for the construction work and purchasing the land, but also to help the family financially, the sisters' studies, clothes, diapers.
She put a lot of money into making Saïd's family comfortable.
But she did keep track of all of her expenses in Tunisia.
Ghislaine Leclerc also helped Saïd integrate into France. She funded his chef training in Lyon, which enabled him to find a job.
When he left for Lyon, this man was financially comfortable and independent and wanted to discover France. And he met someone there and gradually grew distant from Ghislaine.
In January 2008, Ghislaine discovers on Saïd's phone evidence of her husband's infidelity.
I'm very angry with him for hurting my mother. I asked him at their wedding to take care of her because she really needed it, and he betrayed my trust.
After discovering her husband's infidelity, Ghislaine Leclerc began to doubt the sincerity of Saïd's love. She then decided, 4 years after the marriage, to file for divorce. And immediately she started a fight to recover the money that she had spent in Tunisia since they met.
After the separation, Ghislaine was very angry about the betrayal. She wanted to restore some balance, and she wanted to fight to recover all of her investments in Tunisia, for her and for her daughters.
The dispute was very violent between them. She went so far as to get Tunisian citizenship, which is an exceptional legal process to go through, to be able to benefit from Tunisian law.
Having become Tunisian, Ghislaine Leclerc hoped to recover ownership of the villa in Djerba and the olive grove. Tensions were now running high.
I knew it was turning into war. Things were getting very heated between them. She wanted to get her money back at all costs.
She suffered verbal abuse. The horrors she heard were not worthy of a human being, to put it simply.
The police established that Ghislaine Leclerc was killed a few hours after receiving a very important phone call. just a few hours after being informed of great news.
Around 11 a.m., she got a call from Tunisia, where she was informed that the real estate she was claiming in Tunisia was the subject of a judicial mortgage. There was a good chance the property would be returned to her.
This meant that after the divorce, Ghislaine would finally have been able to recover full ownership of the Djerba Villa and the olive grove.
But if she died before the divorce was finalized and before recovering her property, her husband would inherit it, and that is what happened.
Is it possible that Saïd killed Ghislaine Leclerc to keep ownership of the real estate in Tunisia?
The motive, very clearly, is money. It's the property in Tunisia. It's an acrimonious divorce, and the fight is over property.
In this fight, Saïd became more and more threatening and went as far as making death threats.
Ghislaine confided to me her fear of being killed. She said, "He's capable of anything. He's capable of anything, including murdering me." I remember it clearly. She was in dire straits.
She was very scared. She always told us, if I die one day, do an autopsy, because she was afraid of being poisoned since he was a chef.
Saïd becomes the #1 suspect. The investigators bring him in.
He says he's completely shocked and distressed by Miss Leclerc's death. He immediately says he had nothing to do with it.
The investigators ask him to explain where he was that week and the night of the murder.
He tells them that he was in Tunisia from August 12th to 21st, and from the 23rd, he returned to Lyon where he worked in a restaurant.
Saïd claims to have been working on the night of the crime from 7:30 to 11 p.m. He then says he went to sleep at his brother and sister-in-law's house. To verify this alibi, the police question his brother and his wife.
Obviously, they're not questioned together, and they both confirm that on August 26, after work, he returned to their home. They had a meal together, which was late because it was during Ramadan. After the meal, everyone went to bed. The brother and sister-in-law state that Saïd slept in their son's room. They explained that if he had come out during the night, since the apartment wasn't very big, they would most likely have heard him. Above all, the next morning, Saïd's sister-in-law, wanting to check on her son in the room, poked her head around the door and saw her son, as well as Saïd.
It was then 6:30 in the morning. The police check Saïd's cell phone's GPS tracking, which confirms that on the night of the murder, the young man was in Lyon.
At no point do the investigators place Saïd at the crime scene.
But the police continue to suspect Saïd. From October 13, 2010, a month and a half after the murder, the Dijon surveillance unit starts tailing the Tunisian husband.
He's tailed. They try to identify the places he goes, the people he sees, what his habits are, and what company he keeps.
Saïd's phone is also wiretapped.
They wait for him to make a mistake. The investigators hope that at some point he'll say something or try to run away, that something will give him away, because for the investigators, he's in the eye of the storm.
But the police don't get any evidence against the Tunisian.
In reality, after all these checks, there's nothing. The only thing that could turn the case around, apart from police custody, is a confession.
7 months after the murder, on March 30th, 2011, at 8:15 a.m., Saïd is taken into custody. The investigators are convinced that he had a financial interest in Ghislaine Leclerc's death. They also believe that the conflict between him and the victim may have led to the murder.
When Saïd was taken into custody, I thought he was the culprit because he didn't want to admit, to use a strong word, that he had prostituted himself for nothing.
The police now want a confession.
The investigators, even before talking about the murder, try to make Saïd say that he wanted to kill his wife because it was a sham marriage and he had financial interest in her death.
But Saïd claims that he was sincerely attached to Ghislaine Leclerc and that their relationship fell apart despite himself.
The police have nothing to hold against him, except an idea.
The investigators try to put pressure on him to make him slip up and eventually confess.
I think the time in custody is extremely difficult for Saïd.
But the young husband firmly denies any involvement in the murder of Ghislaine Leclerc. Without any material proof of their suspect's guilt, the police decide after 15 hours of custody to release the Tunisian. he goes free from the police station. Jean-Marc, it seems that the police are convinced that Saïd is guilty. However, they end his custody after 15 hours of interrogation. Why, in your opinion, don't they continue questioning him?
I think the police were under the impression that placing Saïd in custody was going to bring about his confession. They have very strong suspicions against him. They know that he has a financial interest in his wife's death, but they have no material evidence to back up these suspicions. On the contrary, Saïd has a solid alibi, since his brother, his sister-in-law, and his employer stated in detail that he was in Lyon that night. What's more, his phone records didn't show that he was in Volesvres on the night of the crime. So it's understandable that the investigators released him in the hopes of finding some more solid evidence so they can place Saïd in custody again.
We've seen how the police carried out many investigations in the hopes of finding evidence of Saïd's involvement. They wiretapped him and they had him tailed by the Dijon surveillance unit. Jean-Marc, how does this tailing work?
Back when I was on the force, working on organized crime and terrorism cases, I coordinated and took part in numerous surveillance operations. We call tailing operations hideouts in our jargon. To avoid being spotted, there must be quite a few of them. It's estimated that to follow someone for a certain period, 24 hours a day, it takes around 20 officers. Obviously, in Saïd's case, we're not at that level. It's simply a question of following him, to see who he contacts, and if he lives the way he says he does, as a chef who comes back every night to sleep at his brother's house.
What do you think about Saïd and his possible involvement in the murder?
On paper, he's the ideal culprit. As they say, he checks all the boxes. He has a vested interest. He is in open conflict with the victim. Everything points to him. But without evidence, we mustn't jump to conclusions. As I often say, investigating is about a culture of doubt. We must be willing to question ourselves. We must be willing to consider new leads and new lines of investigations.
Genetic analysis proved that the unknown male DNA found at the crime scene was not Saïd's. But a few months later, in a dramatic turn of events, the person this mysterious DNA belongs to is finally identified. On July 4, 2011, almost a year after the murder, the examining magistrate receives the results of an important genetic test. The DNA profiles of the various responders at the crime scene were compared to the unknown profile found near the victim's body. And to everyone's surprise, there's a match. It's the DNA of the medical examiner who was called to the house after the discovery of the murder.
Anyone who responds to a crime scene can contaminate the crime scene. In our eagerness to take a look, we might not be fully equipped or have paid attention to all the precautions we should have.
The results don't help the investigation to progress. Then, in November 2011, 15 months after the murder, the examining magistrate summons the victim's loved ones.
She asked us if in the months following our mother's death, our friends' or family's behavior changed. And then for me, it suddenly clicked.
Estelle Pelletier communicates her doubts about Sylvain Schrott, her sister Celine's partner.
I told the judge that I had concerns and that I needed to be reassured.
Sylvain Schrott was the last family member to see Ghislaine alive. He also seemed to be the least affected by the tragedy.
15 days later, when we met at my dad's house, he said to my husband, "The girl should move on now." That's a little hard to hear. Losing a loved one is already hard enough. But in that way, everything falls to pieces.
The investigators focus on Sylvain Schrott, Ghislaine Leclerc's son-in-law.
The police inspect Sylvain Schrott's phone records. They notice that his cell phone was traced in Bagnols on the night of the murder, August 27, at 1:41 a.m. Bagnols is a small village near the A36 highway, about halfway between Récouville in Alsace, where Sylvain Schrott lives, and Volesvres.
So why did Sylvain Schrott, during his first interview a few days after the murder, tell the police that he had spent the night at home in Alsace?
It's a dramatic twist in the investigation, so the investigator's first reaction is, he lied. He hid from us that he was on the highway. On the night of the murder, he was near his mother-in-law's home.
The investigators begin to suspect Sylvain Schrott and start looking for a motive. They study his phone records and notice something else unexpected.
They find out that he called Ghislaine Leclerc between August 23 and August 26 on several occasions.
Which is very surprising because they never called each other, really never. So we were wondering, what do they have to say to each other so many times in such a short space of time?
And particularly strange is the fact that Sylvain Schrott stopped calling his mother-in-law after August 26th, even though the murder was only discovered on Sunday the 29th.
The investigators wonder if he might have known that Ghislaine Leclerc was dead.
The analysis of Sylvain Schrott's phone records reveals another very surprising piece of information.
Hundreds and hundreds of conversations, mainly by SMS, took place between Mr. Schrott and Emmeline Pelletier, Ghislaine's youngest daughter.
A significant number of calls and messages have been exchanged day and night. It surprises the investigators because Emmeline is 16 years old and Sylvain Schrott is 46. There's a 30-year age gap, so it's pretty surprising.
The investigators learned that Emmeline was living with her older sister just before the murder.
In the 2009 to 2010 school year, my little sister went to school in Alsace. To do this, she stayed with my older sister and Sylvain. It's very surprising that there are so many messages between them while living under the same roof.
The investigators are intrigued by this strange relationship.
All this means that the investigators begin to suspect Sylvain Schrott. First, he lied about where he was the night of the murder. Secondly, he contacted Ghislaine Leclerc 3 days before the murder, 18 times. And thirdly, he was in constant contact for months with Emmeline, his partner's little sister and a minor, too.
A year and a half after the murder on February 21st, 2012 at 7:30 a.m., Sylvain Schrott is taken into custody. A search of his home is carried out, but no incriminating evidence is discovered. The police now know that their interrogation will be decisive. At 10:05 a.m., Sylvain Schrott's first interrogation begins. The investigators start by asking him again where he was on the night of the murder.
He keeps saying that he was at home in Riquevier in Alsace and that he didn't leave his house.
The police know he's lying because they have proof that his cell phone was traced away from his home that night. But for now, they decide not to reveal to Sylvain Schrott what they've discovered. They prefer to question him about the nature of his relationship with Emmeline, the victim's youngest daughter.
Sylvain Schrott tells them, "Our relationship is totally appropriate. She's my wife's sister. She's staying with us so that she can go to school. We have a completely normal relationship."
But you can feel that he's extremely uncomfortable. He puts himself in the position of an observer. He's not spontaneous at all. He tries to scrutinize the person he's talking to and his environment, and he makes a very bad impression.
Sylvain Schrott doesn't know it, but at the same time, Emmeline is also being questioned by the police, and the answers she gives are very different.
Very quickly, she gave in and explained what happened between them.
She tells the police important information. She had sex with Sylvain Schrott, which she says was consensual, but in any case, without the knowledge of his sister, Céline.
Having a romantic and sexual relationship with his partner's sister is fairly extreme when it comes to adulterous relationships. What's more, she's a minor.
She says that he's in love with her. They've had sex, but she isn't in love with him.
The investigators' suspicions were therefore well-founded.
This is crucial information that she delivers to them on a platter.
Armed with this new information, the police try to make the victim's son-in-law crack.
He's shown the phone communications between him and Emeline. The investigators hope this will make him confess to something, because there's proof of extremely frequent calls and texts at all hours of the day and night.
But Sylvain Schrutt sticks to his guns. He keeps saying, no, I was just her confidant. We were just friends.
The police let their suspect get caught in his own lies.
Once they have let him explain that nothing sexual happened with Emeline, once he has lied, they tell him they have Emeline's statement and that Emeline is saying the opposite. This is the first shock during the custody. Clearly, the police are on the full offensive.
The investigators think they've discovered the motive for the murder.
They imagine or try to prove that Ms. Leclerc had discovered the nature of this relationship and possibly wanted to reveal it. So they theorize that Mr. Schrutt, to silence his mother-in-law, decided to get rid of her.
Because everything was at stake for him, his wife, his mistress, his mother-in-law, the family relationships he has built, his stability.
The investigators then ask him if he got along with his mother-in-law.
Regarding his relationship with Ghislaine, Schrutt says that they liked each other. She was the person he valued the most in the family, and they were close.
It's now been 14 hours since custody began. The police decide to play their trump card.
They show him the GPS tracking and tell him, Mr. Schrutt, you lied to us about something extremely important. You went somewhere on the night of the murder.
The police revealed that they know that on the night of the murder, his cell phone was traced far from his home.
They tell him that at 1:41 in the morning, his phone signal was picked up by a cell tower in Bagnols. Bagnols being, according to them, a 1 hour and 19-minute drive from Ms. Leclerc's house. You can tell that Mr. Schrutt is losing his cool and he's stunned by this information. He has no answer to give.
It's now 10:05 p.m.
The police think they are on the right track. They feel that Schrutt is going to crack.
But the suspect doesn't crack and even confidently gives a completely new account of the events.
He admits, to everyone's surprise, that he was at the scene of the crime at a time probably very close to when Ms. Leclerc died.
First, Sylvain Schrutt explains that on August 26th, during a phone call with Ghislaine at 6:42 p.m., he decided to visit her in Volesvres.
When the police ask Schrutt about the nature of this trip, he replies that he had to return the car that Ghislaine had lent him a few days before.
Sylvain Schrutt explains that he got gas at 7 p.m. before driving to Volesvres. He says he arrived at his mother-in-law's house at around midnight.
He explains that he parked as usual, everything seemed normal to him, and he went to the front door. At that moment, the front door was ajar. This surprised him. He called out to Miss Leclerc, no answer. He pushed the door open. He went inside. He looked in the dining room, nobody.
Sylvain Schrutt says he then went to Ghislaine Leclerc's bedroom because a light was on.
He explains that when he got to the entrance of this room, he saw his mother-in-law, who was slumped, curled up a little on her left side, and leaning against her bed in a pool of blood.
As he remembers it, he shook her slightly, and that's when he realized she was dead. He was overcome by a panic attack. He insists there was smell of gunpowder. He immediately makes the connection between the body and gunfire. And that's why he thinks the killer is still there. He has to get out.
Sylvain Schrutt explains that he fled, leaving the door open. He then allegedly stayed in the car parked near the house to smoke a cigarette and think about what he should do.
They ask him why he didn't alert anyone, the emergency services, the police, the neighbors, and he explains that he was in a state of total shock. He also explains that he was very afraid of being accused. He says, with everything you see on TV and crime series and movies, I thought, if I say something, I'm going to be accused.
Sylvain Schrutt didn't tell anyone about what he saw that night. He even acted like it never happened.
Sylvain Schrutt recalls hitting the road again to go home after staying in the car for about 20 minutes. He states that he turned on his phone on the way. According to him, this would explain why his cell phone was traced at 1:41 a.m. in the town of Bagnols. But due to low battery, the device allegedly turned off straight away. Ghislaine Leclerc's son-in-law ends his story by saying that he arrived at his home in Alsace at around 4:15 a.m.
Clearly, the police don't believe his story at all. They don't believe the scene he describes at the house in Volesvres. Absolutely not. They are even, on the contrary, convinced that he was the one who killed Miss Leclerc. That's where they're at.
Nagar, Sylvain Schrut is suspected of killing his mother-in-law because he feared the latter was aware of his relationship with Emmeline, his 16-year-old sister-in-law. What would have happened if Ghislaine Leclerc had reported him? Would Sylvain Schrut risk prosecution?
If Ghislaine Leclerc had reported him, there would undoubtedly have been an investigation, but it isn't certain that this investigation would have resulted in a conviction. In French law, the age of consent is 15 years old. This means that an adult can have sexual intercourse with a 15-year-old minor as long as she consents. Going back to our case, even if the situation may seem morally reprehensible since Emmeline was 16 years old when the relationship began, and since Sylvain doesn't seem to have forced her, it's unlikely he'd be convicted.
At the start of his police custody, Sylvain Schrut was informed of his right to assistance from a lawyer. He renounced this right, and very soon the interrogations put him in a difficult situation. Could he have changed his mind and asked to see a lawyer?
Absolutely. The refusal by a person being held in custody to be assisted by a lawyer is never final. If, in the middle of an interrogation, a person being held in custody feels vulnerable and wants a lawyer, the investigators have to grant this request. They will then suspend the interrogation pending the arrival of a lawyer appointed by the person in custody himself or an official.
As a criminal lawyer, you're regularly called to assist people who are being held in custody. At this stage of the proceedings, a lawyer doesn't have access to the case file. So with someone like Sylvain Schrut, who keeps changing his story, what advice can you give to your client?
As the law stands, the lawyer assisting their client in police custody doesn't have access to the entire file, only a tiny fraction of the accusations. Our room for maneuver as a lawyer, at least at this stage of the proceedings, is therefore limited. The best advice we can give to the client, especially if the situation seems tense, is to exercise the right to remain silent.
After 24 hours of police custody, the investigators request and obtain an extension for another 24-hour period. Whose decision is it to grant this extension, and is it automatic?
In principle, police custody lasts 24 hours. Exceptionally, if necessary for the investigation and proportionate to the gravity of the crime, it can be extended by another 24 hours. In this case, the extension is made with the written authorization of the public prosecutor. In practice, especially for the most serious criminal cases, 48-hour police custody is granted almost systematically.
On February 22, 2012, at 8:30 a.m., the interrogations resume. The police, convinced of Sylvain Schrut's guilt, know they only have one more day of custody to point out all the contradictions in his story. The first contradiction the suspect will have to explain? The duration of the journey between Alsace and the victim's house. Schrut claimed to have made the trip in one go.
The contradiction is that if he left at 7 p.m. and drove continuously for 4 hours, he would have arrived in Volesvres at 11 p.m.
But at 11 p.m., Ghislaine Leclerc was still alive. Her phone records proved that she made her last call at 12:06 a.m.
So he couldn't have arrived once Ghislaine Leclerc was dead, as he claimed.
Faced with the police's accusations, Sylvain Schrut changes his story once again.
He explains that he may have stopped to drink a coffee or smoke a cigarette, but he had forgotten.
Sylvain Schrut has been in police custody for 30 hours.
I think he is very tired and worried. The investigators have put maximum pressure on him.
During a break between interrogations, alone in his cell, the suspect bursts into tears.
It's outside the interrogation. He's alone. Mr. Schrut sobs very loudly in the custody cell. And this is noted in the proceedings.
So now the investigators think, that's it. He's going to confess. He's more vulnerable. He can't cope anymore. He's finally going to talk.
The police get back to work.
If you touch the body, how is it possible that you didn't step in the pool of blood and no traces of blood were seen leading to the front door?
With each new question, the suspect offers a new story.
by saying, "In fact, I was wrong before. I didn't go up to Ghislaine's body. I was scared. I didn't want to tell you because I thought you would make a hateful moral judgment about me. I didn't check to see if she was alive or not. In fact, I stopped at the doorstep and I ran away. That's why there was no blood in the hallway."
Mr. Schrott and the investigators both having engaged in the game of bluff, the investigators end up asking him outright, "Did you kill Miss Leclerc?"
To this question, Sylvain Schrott keeps giving the same answer.
He always responds no.
Did you go there to murder your mother-in-law that night? He maintains his position and says, "No, I wasn't the one who killed Ghislaine Leclerc."
However, after 41 hours of police custody, Sylvain Schrott is sent before the examining magistrate and immediately indicted for the murder of his mother-in-law. He is then placed in pretrial detention.
My big sister is completely lost. Everything is falling apart for her. She lost her mother, and her husband has been taken away by the police. It's unbearable. I feel like it's my fault and I shouldn't have brought up my concerns. My husband reassures me that I did the right thing.
Jean-Marc, Sylvain Schrott is placed in custody a year and a half after the murder. It all started with the examining magistrate summoning Ghislaine Leclerc's daughters and asking them if they had noticed any changes in behavior among their mother's relatives. Why did it take so long for these questions to be asked?
What you have to understand is that from the very beginning of this case, the investigators have had no shortage of serious leads. There was, of course, Ghislaine Leclerc's first husband, who was convicted of first-degree murder, and then there was the homeless gardener. There were these dates she had with men from the internet, and then there was the third husband, Saïd, who she had conflict with and who she was even divorcing. So all the leads were explored and closed one after the other until the investigation came to a gridlock. That was when the examining magistrate considered it useful to summon the victim's daughters and to try and give new momentum to the investigation.
But at the same time, don't you think this initiative came a little late?
Yes, it's difficult for me to say otherwise, especially when we know that this new lead is Sylvain Schrott, Ghislaine Leclerc's son-in-law. I find it surprising that the investigators were not interested from the very start of the investigation in the victim's family members and didn't check their phone records to see where they were and who was communicating with whom at the time of the murder.
During his custody, Sylvain Schrott kept lying and changing his story. But the investigators failed to get a confession. Jean-Marc, what do you think of the way the interrogations were conducted?
From a technical point of view, this police custody was carried out properly. The investigators played to their strengths. As Sylvain Schrott's statements progressed, they confronted him with his contradictions and his lies, until they made him tell part of the truth. Only he didn't get to the full confession. What do we have at the end of this custody? We have a possible motive. Sylvain Schrott allegedly killed his mother-in-law so that she wouldn't reveal his affair with his young sister-in-law. What's more, he finally admits that he was at the crime scene around the time when the murder was committed. All these serious and consistent details allow the examining magistrate to indict Sylvain Schrott.
After the shocking news of Sylvain Schrott's indictment, Ghislaine Leclerc's daughters, informed by their lawyer of the case material, are stunned to learn about the relationship between Emmeline and her brother-in-law.
When I find out that Sylvain had been intimate with my little sister, it makes me very angry that he had this kind of relationship with his sister-in-law. I scream internally. I want to shout.
It was a surprise and a betrayal on Sylvain's part. We had entrusted our daughter to him.
Emmeline then confides to her father her fear of being shunned by the family.
And I reassured her. I told her that I wouldn't shun her or like her any less for that, because in fact she was a victim too, and she had nothing to feel ashamed of. I took her in my arms and let her know that I loved her very much and that none of this changed anything.
Summoned by the examining magistrate, Emmeline must give an account of her relationship with Sylvain Schrott.
Sylvain wanted to have sex with my little sister Emmeline, and she didn't want to. He insisted, he coaxed her, he gave her gifts and told her she was pretty. And since that didn't work, he became vile towards Céline, his partner, and their daughter. Until one day, my little sister, to restore the peace, gave in. And then she was under his control.
Emmeline felt trapped.
He told her that if she told us about it, we would shun and disown her, so she would lose us. If she didn't do what he wanted, he was going to tell us.
On September 6, 2012, it's Sylvain Schrott's turn to be questioned by the examining magistrate.
Sylvain Schrott explains that the relationship with Emmeline was something he put up with, since he feels that he was seduced by Emmeline and that he gave in to her extremely insistent advances.
From a moral point of view, it poses no problem for him that she was a minor or that she's the sister of his own wife.
So who is Sylvain Schrott really? The examining magistrate looks for character witnesses on this man accused of shooting his mother-in-law in cold blood.
He's a man who loves women. He likes seduction. He tries to get them all. He tried with me too.
Sylvain Schrott has 5 children by 3 different women. The last one was born from his marriage with Céline, the victim's eldest daughter.
Ghislaine didn't like Sylvain because he was horrible to his wife, our daughter.
He wasn't an upfront person, and my sister liked upfront people. She told me several times she didn't like him.
That's when a very interesting testimony is brought to the case.
The police asked Schrott's first wife if she had seen a gun in the house. Contrary to what Schrott said, she remembers that in 2002, she saw a gun at home, a short black pistol with a short barrel, which could match the description of the murder weapon, a small Beretta.
The ex-wife even remembers one particularly dramatic incident.
She claims that during their separation, Sylvain Schrott took out the gun and pointed it at his head. He threatened to kill himself.
Ghislaine Leclerc's family is aware of the progress of the investigation.
It's a heavy-going time and makes our relationship as sisters difficult because he's still Céline's husband.
So there was Emmeline, Estelle and me on one side, and Céline on the other, since for Céline, her husband couldn't have done it. Which was very understandable, but for us, given all the facts, it was very plausible.
It's painful to go through as sisters, but we do our best to stick together.
It caused palpable tension within the family. But the good thing is that despite everything, the family has remained close-knit.
When the examining magistrate decides to send Sylvain Schrott before the criminal court, the victim's family faces a new ordeal.
We need answers. Céline also needs answers and hopes the investigation will be proven wrong. And we hope that the trial will prove the investigation right.
On October 20th, 2014, almost 4 years after the murder of Ghislaine Leclerc, the trial of Sylvain Schrott opens before the Masson Criminal Court.
I don't want him to be guilty, but I don't believe him.
In the dock, Sylvain Schrott, who continues to protest his innocence, has an aggressive and unpleasant attitude. At the end of the debate, the assistant public prosecutor requests for the crime of first-degree murder, a prison sentence with a minimum duration of 20 to 25 years. After 3 hours of deliberations, he's sentenced to 18 years in prison. He immediately appeals this decision. On September 22, 2015, Sylvain Schrott's appeal trial opens before the Besançon Criminal Court.
When I get to the trial, I'm hoping that he will confess and get more than 18 years in prison.
From the first day, Sylvain Schrute shows a very different side to the court.
He clearly benefited from the dress rehearsal that the first trial was for him. And now things go much better. He answers questions, he doesn't express unpleasant opinions, he isn't unpleasant to anyone, and things go much more smoothly.
For the first time, Sylvain Schrute takes responsibility.
He even admits that he initiated his relationship with Emmeline and regrets it. He recognizes that this relationship is inappropriate. This is a gigantic step compared to the investigation and the first trial.
For this second trial, the defendant's lawyers have a well-established line of defense.
The first thing is to destroy the motive concerning the fact that his relationship with Emmeline was going to be or had been revealed to Ghislaine Leclerc.
Emmeline is then called to the stand.
It's a lonely moment for her.
Probably, she knew deep down inside that her answer was going to determine whether Sylvain Schrute was convicted or not.
The central question of this trial is now whether Ghislaine Leclerc was aware of the relationship between Emmeline and Sylvain Schrute.
Emmeline confirms that she hadn't told her mother about it, nor was she planning to, nor had she told anyone else she knew.
The defense emphasizes the importance of this testimony.
If Ghislaine was unaware, Sylvain Schrute had absolutely no interest in killing Ghislaine Leclerc. The motive disappears.
The defense lawyers then return to the mystery of the missing murder weapon.
A silencer was obviously used since no one heard anything. In other words, this was a crime committed by a professional, which Mr. Schrute is obviously not.
And the defense manages to prove that his ex-wife's damning testimony is baseless.
During the courtroom debates, it emerged that the so-called gun that he had in his possession years earlier, which his ex-wife spoke about, was a replica, a reproduction of a real gun.
The last big moment of the trial is the testimony of Ghislaine Leclerc, the victim's eldest daughter. Separated from the defendant shortly after his indictment, she nevertheless reaffirms her trust in him.
They challenge her. But he lied. He said nothing. For months, he lied to you. He hid that he had seen the body. And once again, Céline explains that the Sylvain Schrute she knows could have behaved this way for many reasons, without having any involvement in Ghislaine Leclerc's death.
I'm very surprised by Céline's testimony about the fact that she finds it normal that Sylvain didn't tell the police and for 18 months didn't say anything. I disagree with her completely because it strikes me that a person who says he loves our mom to hide something like that from us. If he's innocent, it makes no sense to me.
After the assistant public prosecutor requests an 18-year prison sentence, it's time for the defense arguments.
We ask the judge, given the absence of serious evidence in this case, to acquit Sylvain Schrute outright. We're very worried. We know that an acquittal is going to be very difficult to obtain, so we're extremely worried while the deliberations are happening.
The jurors take 3 hours to make their decision. At the end of these 3 hours, they find Sylvain Schrute not guilty.
When the not guilty verdict comes in, it's hugely emotional. Sylvain Schrute is completely stunned. First, he doesn't understand that he's been acquitted. We have to tell him again that he's been acquitted because he doesn't understand. He's been in prison for 4 years. He completely breaks down.
For the plaintiffs, it's a bitter disappointment.
When the verdict falls, I fall with it. I fall apart. My world falls apart. I'm in a state of shock. I'm still in this state of shock. For me, that day, the justice system murdered my mom a second time.
Nagar, Sylvain Schrute was at first sentenced to 18 years in prison, and on appeal, he was acquitted. It seems that his lawyers played a big part in this.
It's always a combination of factors that lead to a satisfactory verdict. Obviously, the lawyers play an essential role, but so does the Chief Justice in the way they conduct the debates and especially the space they leave for the defense. It's clear that in our case, the lawyers managed, during the appeal trial, to fill this space, to cast doubt on Schrutt's guilt, and to demonstrate that the prosecution's evidence was not irrefutable.
Do you think that Sylvain Schrutt's change of attitude from one trial to the other also had an influence on the jury's decision?
Yes, no doubt. It's like everywhere. If someone inspires empathy, we don't want to condemn them. In our case, the fact that Schrutt presented himself in the appeal trial as more confident, calm, and sincere allowed the court to consider the facts differently than in the first trial.
We heard Randall Schwerdorfer, one of Schrutt's lawyers, say that he was very worried during the deliberations. What is this wait like for a lawyer?
In general, waiting for the deliberations is intense because we have grown attached to the client and their case. But when we also consider that the case is fragile and that a conviction could lead to a miscarriage of justice, the lawyer's wait is even more difficult. Specifically, when the court withdraws to deliberate, we leave the courtroom and our clients, since they're usually detained. Then we keep busy however we can for a few hours, for example, by working on other cases or even meeting up with friends and colleagues, waiting for the court's administration to tell us to come back because the verdict is imminent.
Sylvain Schrutt's acquittal marks the end of the proceedings for the murder of Ghislaine Leclerc. During the appeal trial, the lawyers of the victim's son-in-law had, however, sought to weaken the prosecution by pointing the finger at another lead that they believed was abandoned too quickly during the investigation.
We can't ignore the fact that another person, who was accused at some point in the case, had a motive too. The lead of the Tunisian husband is as serious as the Schrutt lead.
But is it possible that Saïd was involved in the murder, even though it was proven that on the night of the incident he was in Lyon?
The possibility that he was physically present when Miss Leclerc was killed has been completely ruled out.
It would still have been necessary, according to Sylvain Schrutt's lawyers, to continue investigating the Tunisian husband.
He has an alibi that stands up. He has an alibi that has been verified, so there's no problem there. However, what we still don't know, and this is a lead that, in my opinion, is still open today, is whether he had the means to have Ms. Leclerc assassinated.
The investigators know that Saïd returned from his vacation in Tunisia 4 days before the murder. Did he take advantage of this trip to order a hit?
The examining magistrate asked the police in Tunisia to carry out several checks in terms of Saïd's relationships and assets abroad. It turns out that this was in the middle of the Arab Spring, and this international letter rogatory from France to Tunisia never came back to France.
I'm deeply convinced that at the time, the Tunisian authorities had better things to do than deal with a French legal affair, when they were in the midst of a major political crisis.
According to Sylvain Schrutt's lawyers, it's currently impossible to rule out the possibility that Saïd ordered the murder in Tunisia.
The fact that the letter rogatory in Tunisia never came back is very problematic because we don't know everything about Saïd's life in his country of origin. We don't know about his social or professional ties, so we don't know what he could have ordered or not from his home country.
Jean-Marc, do you think that Saïd could have ordered Ghislaine Leclerc's assassination?
We lack concrete evidence to be able to answer that question, especially when it comes to Saïd's past. You know full well, when we start an investigation, the first thing we do is consult all the available files accessible to the police forces to get an idea of the person we're investigating. But here, it hasn't been possible. Tunisia didn't respond to the international letter rogatory, so we don't know anything about Saïd's past. We don't know if Saïd has been prosecuted or convicted. It isn't clear on what grounds he would have been convicted. We don't know what company he keeps, if they're violent or dangerous people. The only thing we can say is that despite all the research carried out in France, it hasn't been possible to establish that Saïd ordered the murder of Ghislaine Leclerc.
During Sylvain Schrutt's appeal trial, his lawyer, Chloé Bonat, explained that the killer most likely used a silencer since no one heard anything. So for her, the murder was carried out by a professional. Do you share this opinion?
First, the concept of a professional killer generally, and in this case, strikes me as a fantasy. I don't know of anyone in France who regularly earns a living by killing other people. If Ghislaine Leclerc was the victim of a murder for hire, I'm more inclined to believe it was a crime committed by a habitual offender who, in return for a sum of money, agreed to turn into a killer. However, the fact that no one heard anything doesn't necessarily mean that the gun was fitted with a silencer. The Beretta 1934 is a gun that doesn't make much noise. If we add to this that the window and the shutters in the victim's room were closed, it isn't surprising that the sound of the shots didn't alert the neighborhood.
Does the modus operandi of Ghislaine Leclerc's killing suggest a murder for hire?
The killer's determination, composure, and the fact that no traces were left inside the house could suggest this kind of crime. In any case, this is the only lead that the investigation has not managed to rule out for good. That's why I think that the public prosecutor should put an examining magistrate back on the case, so that new research can be carried out to identify Ghislaine Leclerc's killer.
I think about her very often. I miss her voice. I miss her hands. I miss her sweetness. I miss her songs.
I miss her every day. Every day. Every night when I see the sunset, sometimes I want to call her. She's not here. She's gone. I can never call her again.
Added to the pain of her absence is the pain of not knowing the truth.
I'd like to say that if at the time some people stayed quiet, now might be the time to tell the truth. To reopen the investigation so that a murderer doesn't go free and unpunished.
I think my mom is dead. No one is in prison. Yet someone killed her. If no one killed her, then bring mom back to us. I think that like a little girl. Since there's a death, there's a culprit. We can't leave it like this. We can't stop searching. It's not understandable. It's not acceptable.
Ghislaine Leclerc was a sensitive, generous, and courageous woman, a loving, tender, and attentive mother. Her murder left her 3 daughters without a mother, and the investigation to solve the crime broke up the family unit. But today, the lies and disagreements are forgotten. United by love, Céline, Estelle, and Emmeline continue their lives, hoping to know one day who killed their mother.